Good afternoon. Welcome to Friday afternoon at the Manor. And my name is John Joseph Massandrea, and we're going to hear a wonderful synopsis with Julia. But we're going to have Susan Johnson, our co-host, who's going to introduce our wonderful speaker for this afternoon. Over to Susan.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And today we're happy to welcome Julia Rady-Shaw, who is going to speak on architecture in Toronto, an endangered species, and its connection to our heritage.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to sort of be back and talk about something that has become very near and dear to my heart. In fact, that's actually where I was coming from, was a long meeting this morning based upon my work with the Toronto Preservation Board. I had the great good fortune of sitting with other really lovely people and saying where we could give some city money for the restoration of some heritage places around the city. So as opposed to trying to mitigate the demolition or other changes to our city's heritage, got to give out money so that it can be restored. So today I'm going to sort of marry a few of these things together and sort of my perspective on architecture and heritage in my own background. My own path to heritage has been rather circuitous, in fact. I worked towards my PhD in Canadian history, hoping to teach, as we all do when we start out. But throughout that experience, I have to confess that part of me wondered what my contribution was going to be to society. How was I going to give back? I had the tremendous privilege of attending school and doing what I loved, but wanting to pay that forward. Did we really need another book about an obscure topic in history that only a small handful of people would read? What could an audience be? So I've not once regretted this schooling. It's taught me how to research, to balance different interpretations of events, to be open to new perspectives. I could let my nerd flag fly. It also made me incredibly aware of the disconnect between what happens in a university classroom or at an academic conference and how we use history as a tool in everyday life, how it becomes sort of little flagpoles for how we understand and we orient ourselves in society. So, my dad does it. Everybody has had an opportunity. We visit ancestry.com to trace our own individual past and learn about family histories. We visit museums and have exhibits and ideas curated for us and the rest of the public. And these distillation of ideas, these ways to understand our path, have an important role to play in society that I don't necessarily think translate to how we do things at a university. It's not to say it's bad, it's just different. I think we need to challenge the status quo and deepen our understanding of our individual past, find connections between one another that we haven't previously appreciated. And I think one of the ways that we can do so is in another sort of forum of public history, which is heritage. It's what we see and we experience every day. It's our heritage sites. And by heritage, I mean houses, built form, architecture that we live in or we visit or with which we interact. It's the Regent Theatre on Mount Pleasant, one of the first of a few theaters constructed in the early 20th century. It's the Agnes MacPhail House on Millwood, just east of Bayview, which is now looking for a new tenant, but which is in fact a designated heritage property in our city because it was one of the only duplexes of its kind constructed by Agnes MacPhail. It's the view towards Queen's Park along University Avenue where you see our impressive legislature. So sometimes it's heritage with a capital H, as things marked with a plaque that tells us of its history. And sometimes it's just a really nifty storefront, or it's a series of storefronts that remind us that, oh yeah, a general store was once there, that this area in which we live and we work and we walk once was inhabited by other people who use these buildings a little bit differently. it's a facade to remind us of what once was, where we came from, and really how our city has grown. So, of all the different ways that history functions in society, I think we both readily understand heritage, or we think we do, because we see it. But I'm not sure if we encounter or we understand how it actually works. We actually have a whole provincial system dedicated to the conservation of important places and spaces. And with this legislation, the Ontario Heritage Act, toolkits to how we understand and interpret it, how we evaluate heritage, how we assess it, and how we assess what change might mean for these spaces. And this is where my really interesting job comes in. So I work at an architectural firm that specializes in heritage conservation, and I'm their historian and cultural heritage specialist. So I get to use all of the tools that, in my toolkit, but now I get to channel it into sort of the realm of heritage. And all of this is really just a fancy way of saying I get to dig through the archives and write stories about our past and the people and the places that have lived here. But now I get to do so in service of the public. And one of the unique things that I've noticed is that we'll talk about sort of the heritage of a place, and we know that there's a Heritage Act, but exactly how this works in society is still a little bit of an unknown. For example, you're living in a lovely home and you happen to find out it is listed on our city's heritage register. Well, what the heck does that mean? Versus a designated property in these different categories. So I'm going to get into that in a little bit. One of the unique challenges in this line of work is discerning if a building or place is something. Does it mean something? Is it worthwhile looking at? Is it really valuable? I don't know if you remember if you watched David Letterman when he was on, but decades ago, he had this sketch called Is It Something? And he would point his camera at a completely innocuous, brick facade or a chair. And he would ask, well, is it something? And it was ridiculous. But in some ways, it does point out the fundamental challenge of asking, well, is it meaningful? Is there value? And that's frequently what we do with heritage. It's easy to ascribe value to some of the more notable places in our city. Take, for example, the R.C. Harris Water Treatment Facility, this gorgeous architectural gem on beautifully landscaped lawns jutting out in your Scarborough. The treatment facility itself, it began construction in 1932 and it opened in 1941. It was a huge undertaking to construct. It's named for Roland Caldwell Harris, the longtime commissioner of the City of Toronto's Department of Public Works. And under Harris, who assumed that position in the early 20th century, Toronto itself was transformed. Harris worked as the commissioner for 33 years. That's a long time to hold a position. And he oversaw the construction of sidewalks, transit tracks, sewers, paved roads, public baths and washrooms, and impressive spans of bridges like the Bloor Viaduct. He included a span on another of the city's sort of bridges that would accommodate subway travel that hadn't even been put in place yet. He was a bit of a visionary. He was committed to improving the city and doing so with style, working with a city architect and city civil engineers to create a vision or a complementary way of understanding and navigating our city. Harris himself, he grew up in Toronto and with rather humble beginnings. And I think this early life shaped his career. His mom was a cleaner and they lived amongst the working class in downtown Toronto. He began his own career as a reporter and was quickly promoted. Whoever he worked for recognized that this guy, he got stuff done and he had something to say. He got married when he was young, and in his marriage, he and his wife, Alice, they lived in an apartment. It was actually part of one of the original City Hall complexes, and it overlooked the ward, that part of the city that was sort of reserved for the Irish poor and the other working poor. He and his wife also, sadly, they lost 3 children in their infancy to strep-related infections. In early 20th century Toronto, we had a lot of cholera epidemics. There was contaminated milk, other waterborne illnesses. Milk hadn't been pasteurized yet. That doesn't happen until, around 1925 or so, maybe just a little bit earlier. So illness and the child mortality rate in the city was high. So I think it's within this context, it's safe to say that Harris was profoundly influenced by his life and his surroundings, by what he saw, by his built form, and how that translated to hospitable living conditions. So his work as commissioner then took this mission, and it was aimed to improve the conditions of the city, to make it a living city. Soon after becoming the Commissioner of Public Works, he set his cap to water purification. And under his program, and with the help of Charles Hastings, our chief medical officer in Toronto at the time, and George Naismith, the civil engineer, the city mortality rate declined significantly as a result of the creation of water purification facilities. We still have one at Ashbridges Bay. There was one, and it continues to function on Toronto Island, because they understood of where the water was pooling and what people were accessing to and what needed to happen. And then, of course, there's the facility that eventually bears his name, the R.C. Harris facility, that still services the city, and I think provides us a substantial portion of our potable water. I think it's this trait, this civic mindedness, and the civic mindedness blent with the idea that just because it's a water purification plant doesn't mean it shouldn't look good too. That helped to set Harris apart. He wasn't just reacting to crises or tossing up his hands in despair. He sought solutions to improve and to prevent, and he did it with style. He took a long view. Maybe this was helped by not being a politician who had to get himself reelected every number of years. You have a different audience that you're performing to. Perhaps it was his own particular approach. To him, projects in his mind should evolve and take place over a generation, and not just, the quick short term or medium term. Oh, if we can't get it done in 3 years. He took a very long view of things and understood that the city was something that ought to evolve. So as I say, I think it's little wonder that this R.C. Harris facility bears his name. It's a beautiful monument to Harris's vision and work for the city that balanced practicality and beauty. It's a feat of architecture and engineering. It was designed in the Art Deco style, and it was meant to make a statement. It's been used for Doors Open Toronto, and the public can actually walk its grounds in order to sort of see and understand it. It has huge marble entryways, and its filtration equipment, water is still on display. It has earned itself the name of the Palace of Purification. And this palace was also immortalized in Michael Ondaatje's In the Skin of the Lion. And actually, a lot of that book by Ondaatje is, I think, a loving tribute to Toronto and its architecture and its period of tremendous growth in the city. I know we're growing now. All of those condos along Lakeshore, we're growing and growing and growing. So it's sometimes hard to remember that this isn't the only time. And in fact, growth and transformation of our city seems to be more the norm rather than the exception. So we know the Harris facility, it's easy to tell that this place is significant. It has value as a heritage site. It should be protected and not demolished. But what about other places in the city? This warehouse down on Eastern Avenue, that house over on Millwood or Belsize, places that are not associated with larger than life public figures whose fingerprints are still extant everywhere within our city. This is where heritage work becomes a little bit trickier. Not everything needs to be grand to have been significant or to make a mark. And this is where we go to, really useful legislation, and to our own city heritage planning services, who have employed people who are well versed in heritage and heritage matters to help sort of define what needs to be preserved. So for heritage, there's actually been evaluation criteria developed under this Ontario Heritage Act, and we've had a few iterations of this act. The most recent is in 2006, and we still use that. And what it did under the act, that it assesses buildings and landscapes, and it sets out criteria in 3 different categories: design and physical value, historical and associative value, and contextual value. Within each of those 3 categories, it's further subdivided. So a property can have design value or physical value if it's rare or unique or representative of a style or type of architecture, if it has a particularly interesting construction method, if it displays a high degree of craftsmanship or artistic merit, or a high degree of technical or scientific achievement. Just to go back to the Harris example, that water filtration facility would have ticked each of those 3 boxes. It is rare. It is highly artistic, has artistic merit, and there's huge technical and scientific achievement as it blends architectural style with a technical and a functional purpose for it. A property can have historical value or associative value because it has an association with a theme or event, a belief or a person, an activity, an organization or an institution. St. James Cathedral downtown would have an association as one of the first sort of churches established within the city of Toronto, as well within that early Toronto community that developed around it. A property can have historical value if it yields or has the potential to yield understanding or information that contributes to an understanding of a community or culture. I'm not saying that it's listed or designated, but lovely Manor Road United has the potential to yield information about the growth of a community in Midtown. And as it's evolved since since the United Church was formed in 1925, but over your nearly 100-year history. It can have historical value if it demonstrates the work of or ideas of an architect, an artist, a builder, or a designer who is significant to a community. So we have lots of famous architects around, the AGO being an example, because it expresses the particular work of an architect. And then we come to contextual value, where a property might be important if it defines or maintains or supports the character of an area. The little house on the corner of Davisville and Yonge Street that used to be a Starbucks and now is who knows what. But at one point, this was one of the first general stores of Davisville, one of the early outlying communities before there was all of this infill and all of this development up in Yonge Street. So we help to understand, and it supports this early street form because next to it you have a row of buildings and shop fronts. So we understand sort of this character of this little block as being commercial almost from the get-go. It can have contextual value if it's physically, functionally, visually, or historically linked to its surroundings. So that there's a landscape, that there's a relationship between a house and its setting. And this is important. And then, of course, it would have value if it's a landmark. Queen's Park, it's a landmark. The now Daniels School of Architecture on Spadina, formerly a mansion, also a landmark. So as it happens, if you're doing, if you put on your heritage consultant hat and you're trying to sort of see if something has value, if you say yes to any one of those 9 criterion, one of those questions, that property is probably worthy of designation under the Act. Now, you need to substantiate it. Like any good historian, You need evidence to support your position. It can't just be, yes, because I liked it. You actually need to say why and how and build a bit of a case. Designation, though, under the Heritage Act provides protection for a property. Means you can't just bulldoze it. You need to be able to carefully and thoughtfully think about that place. One step prior to designation, we have what's called listing a property. And that's just when a municipality like Toronto or Whitby or Oakville will say, we haven't done quite enough research, but we think there's something to this place. They would put it on the heritage registry, sort of like a little check mark or a flag that if something were, comes on down the line, somebody wants to redevelop a property, they want to turn it into 3 houses instead of 2, that type of thing, there's a little check, there's a pause, and you have to say, well, we need to do our due diligence and make sure that it's protected. Designation is a little bit more secure because under designation, you get a city bylaw, which is established and it includes this bylaw, the whole explanation for why there's heritage value in a place. And it includes sort of a point form list of heritage attributes that you can use that would visually denote the value of a building. Often these attributes are architectural detailing. The way that the windows are oriented, the gable on a roof, perhaps a porch or some decorative stonework. So here, the built form or structure and its architecture embodies the history of a place. What's always been curious to me and a little bit harder is that you can't designate based upon use. How can a thing that was once because if we designate for use, is my point, then you're sort of beholden to only perpetuate that use. And you can't imagine a new life or an adaptive reuse of a building. But it's tough when something gets so strongly associated with what it was constructed for. Take, for example, a garment factory or within the King and Spadina area, which was our fashion district. So many of the built form of the buildings in that area were constructed purposely to help with garment production. But that no longer reflects the reality of the 21st century, where we're not making that type of clothes. So we can't protect a place for how it was once used, but we can try and protect it and protect the elements that remind us of what it was once used for within that architectural detailing. Clearly, there are going to be exceptions for this area. And that's when I think you get into what a National Historic Site is, something that is protected on a federal level, and not just within our city or in the province, but on a federal level as being something that is important and worth preserving just as it is. Fort York National Historic Site is a really good example. It is no longer being used as a fort, but now as a museum space, as a place where the public can walk around and, even have public events. You have a visual connection to a past that you don't just want to overwrite. So there's a little bit of complexity involved in when you're looking at the value of a place. It also asks, how can a thing be remembered? How do we go beyond a plaque to remember what was once there? Which brings me to my second big example today about a project that I recently got to do. And it was a pleasure to work on this site. It's a little property out in Etobicoke, or now Rexdale, and it's set away on 51 Panorama Court. And it's just sort of known as the Thistletown Regional for Mental Health and Addiction. So my firm and I, we were contracted to do a heritage evaluation, which meant we went through from the beginning to the end to look at what work has been done, what research has been done, conduct new research on this property, and ascertain what the heritage value of this place might be. And let me tell you, it was a gold mine. Nestled on the top of a knoll is this amazing institutional building where on one side, it's this imposing edifice, but on the other, there's all of these porches. And it's surrounded by huge grassy lawn, groves of trees, and it's right next to the Humber River and some conservation lands. It is a jewel within this city that I did not appreciate was there before. So as we dove into this property, trying to figure out what the connection to mental health would be, we dug a little deeper. And the city listed this property and said, we think there's something to this and we want it to be designated. And what we revealed and what my firm and I did is we blended really disparate histories into one and made a connection. Thistletown opened as the country branch of the Hospital for Sick Children in 1928. The Hospital for Sick Children, which moved a few times, it was on College Street and now it's in its present location, was begun by women, by a former nurse who wanted to give back. And it started as an 8-room little house where they would purposely help children get over things, understanding that children didn't necessarily belong in a grown-up hospital, that the way that you medically assist or you minister to children was a little bit different. So they created the Hospital for Sick Children. They quickly outgrew their space. And so they moved their locations and huge innovation happened within the Hospital for Sick Children. It attracted amazing scholarship. This is where we get the purification or the pasteurization of milk is invented here. They are the first to develop pablum or baby formula so that you could nourish children if there wasn't an ability to breastfeed or if they were away from parents. So such innovation. One of the other things that the hospital did was recognize that perhaps convalescence was necessary. So the chair of the Hospital for Sick Kids in the late 19th century, his name was David Robertson, and he was a newspaper man. He established the Lakeside School for Children on Toronto Island. And it was a lovely house where children could go and spend summer months if they had if they were over the worst of what they were dealing with, but if they had asthma, tuberculosis that they were getting over, and they needed to reside outside because the conventional thinking at the time was that access to fresh air just helped to aid the convalescence. It was a very popular spot, but it's Toronto Island, and you really can't use it year round. So the trustees of the Hospital for Sick Children in the very early, in the 1910s, early 1920s, thought we need to change location. And so they started to look around the city for another property that they could use. Not necessarily on the lake, but something that was more rural, that had this bucolic atmosphere where they could plant trees like pines or spruce, the smell of which of pine and spruce was thought to be beneficial to children. And they struck upon Thistletown in Rexdale, now part of Etobicoke. And they built this special facility just for children. There was huge attention to the construction of this facility to make sure that it was airy and it was comfortable. So you know how I mentioned that there was this very imposing edifice. Well, that was the administrative side. The porches were on the back were so that you could wheel children out on their hospital beds to have exposure to the sun. Kids could go and take picnics on the grounds so that they would have exposure to the air, etc., in a place that was removed from the city. It was thought to be a really useful escape. It was opened in 1928, and it served its public until 1954. It had iron lungs. It was one of the first to treat tuberculosis in patients, and then the children would convalesce some further. Some kids would remain for a matter of days or weeks, others for longer periods of time. But by the late 1940s, because other hospitals within the city and around, they were just growing, the city was changing drastically. The need for this particular facility its attendance dropped. They just couldn't quite sustain it, so it sold, and they sold it to the Ontario government for use as a mental health care facility. But funny enough, this mental health care facility was used specifically for children. So over 2 eras of use, it was both used for healthcare and both used specifically for children, and both used almost with the same idea and understanding that for the treatment of mental health issues in children, probably going outside was a good thing, that it encouraged independence. There's still some of the unsavory bits in there. Having done the walk around, I will say, seeing the padded rooms was a little bit disconcerting. So there's still, that element. I'm not trying to paint it as this rosy utopia of mental health care. But it is, I think, interesting to see that the rationale for a facility dedicated to children span decades. Thistletown as a facility for mental health closed in 2014, unfortunately. And now people just don't know what to do with it. But it's been untouched really since that time, and it's been really, really well maintained. So what we did is we did the research. I found out all of this lovely information and got some amazing old photos of the place, and we put together our report. And then that criteria that I just ran through, we did an evaluation, and it met almost all of those categories. It actually, to our minds, actually met criteria that bumped up its significance, that it wasn't just an important place to our city. It certainly was. But I think, and I argued, that it was an important place for our province. There was no place else in the province at that time where kids could go, and people would come from across the province to use this country branch of Thistletown. That it was a remarkable reflection of the ingenuity of Sick Kids, which was and continues to be, to a certain extent, a leader in pediatric medicine and innovation across the province. And the government agreed with us, which is lovely. That does not often happen, let me tell you. And so it's got protection not only within the city, but as a provincial heritage property of provincial significance, which I try not to say too many times quickly because I always stumble over it. But I think this is a neat facility where its history is reflected in its design, with airy porches, huge windows, lots of skylights. So it was purposely built, and its architecture reflected its purpose and its use. But now what to do with it? A hospital's not going to go back in there. And so this is where we can play what if and what could be. What would be a good adaptive reuse? You don't want to demolish it, but if it's not going to be the same thing it once was, how do we move forward with heritage? And I think this is one of the challenges that our city is facing. How do we reflect our past, but continue to move forward? If, as it was under Harris, a city that constantly evolves and indeed continues to evolve and change, how do we safeguard those markers, those things that got us to this point, but also create some level of innovation? You need to create space. So things like the ROM and its extension, in principle, is lovely. We can discuss till the cows come home whether we think it was a really well executed design. But I think in principle, that is a really neat way to express both a modern and a heritage element that allows this museum to continue to be and accommodate its audiences across the city. How do we harness our past for the future? How do we use it in a way where we don't just retain the facade of a building and then slap a condominium on behind it? Heritage and our historic places have shaped and continue to shape our city. So it makes sense to continue to use them, but with a mind to our current context. how do we intensify so that we're not just this one big urban sprawl? How can we do it sensitively so it's not just 60-story condominiums? Is there a way to have more middle form housing, more duplexes? And this, I think, this speaks to more urban planning and less about history and heritage, but just how our city has evolved and what it's responded to. I think it's also interesting that you have developers who want to demolish things, but I think adaptive reuse, more expensive, of course, but it's almost more inherently green because there's all of this built carbon, like this pent up carbon in a building. When you demolish it, it's released. It's a bigger footprint. But when we can reuse a building, then suddenly you are preserving the past, but also not creating unnecessary pollution. How do you figure out if that little house means something, if it's only important to your family? Well, unfortunately, it means that some things actually do get demolished, and you pave paradise and you put up a parking lot with a plaque to commemorate it. So I think there are opportunities within heritage to just do it better. Because at some point, I'm sure we've all walked up and down Millwood, to bring back Agnes MacPhail House. And 9 out of 10 times, we're going to ignore that plaque. It's that 1 out of 10 times when you realize, oh, there's something here, and you can pause and you can listen. But is there something better than a plaque? Things like Doors Open Toronto is certainly a way to help that in our city, where we get to see inside some notable and interesting places that you would not necessarily have looked. It's the stables next to Casa Loma that, everybody and all tourists, they'll go and they'll see these magnificent grounds at Casa Loma designed by Sir Henry Pellet, or constructed under Sir Henry Pellet as his home. But just across the street are these impressive stables that could be a house now. It's just crazy. So we get sort of more insights into our past that way. I've got no clear answers, but I think more of these conversations about our history and heritage and the way that we can represent them in the architecture of our city and the way that we adapt that architecture going forward, I think it helps shape the conversation going forward. And I think it's important to have, because it makes you mindful of when you're walking down the street. You will pause and you'll say, hey, wait a second. I wonder what this once was. Or you can see the echoes or the shadows of the past as reflected in where we are going. And we see the way that history interacts with the present on a daily basis. So I think heritage is a very public act of history. I think heritage is also not mutually exclusive from development. I think you can have good development and preserve or conserve heritage. But so frequently we think that development is the enemy of heritage, as opposed to changing the conversation and asking them more in questions like, okay, well, how can we do this better? If you are going to redevelop this, how can you incorporate heritage? What is good design? And I think these are a lot of the touch points that we're seeing in the current context. And I think there's a lot of tension about within not just our city, but across Ontario about, well, what do we preserve and how do we grow? And how do we accommodate affordable housing for everybody? So all of these things tie in together. So I think, as you can see, I might have started in one place with a degree in history, but it's taken so many different permutations. And I think it's an interesting one to explore within the everyday. It's not just, about downtown Toronto, but it's about our little parts of the city and the ways that we look at things. One of, I think, the most innovative ways that we understand our heritage is through things called conservation districts, where it's not just one building, but it's a whole area. Cabbagetown is a great example, where there's a whole heritage conservation district where the city has recognized that, this whole area, there's a relationship of the houses to one another. The narrow, gabled, built form, built close together to the edge of the property, heavily treed lots. All of these things are important. So this is an area where context becomes really, really crucial. And it's not even so much heritage about architecture, but that interplay between the built form, between its history, and then, as I say, the context around us. We're forever walking in footsteps of the past as we sort of move forward. I thought that for the sake of this chat, just because it's sort of interesting, I know this is one of the final in the speakers series, that I would open up and we could do just sort of a larger conversation about heritage in the city. If you've got questions for me, then this would be a really lovely time to explore it, because it is such a vast topic. And I think, to my point earlier in my chat, I think conversation is where it's at. So I'd love to know what everybody else has to say or to think, or questions they have.
Hello, Julie. I'd love to go for a walk around the city with you. You'd be absolutely amazing. Every neighbor would be remarkable. And you should think of doing a TV show on CTV or CBC.
I want TVO to do what the BBC does in England, where you have, I don't have the delicious accent that they do on the BBC, but where they take around a place and you get sort of immersed in a history. I think that would be one of the ways to do our own heritage better. Oh
yeah, and speaking of Cabbagetown, if you ever want to come for a walkabout, if they were there, I did. It's interesting because there's a Cabbagetown Historical Society. I can't remember what they call it actually. And I did a walkabout with a person. Actually, I conducted their wedding a couple of years ago, and we only did it for an hour or two, but there were so many things to discover and be part of, and it's actually quite interesting. It's interesting because when you mentioned the neighborhood, I have noticed that house on Davisville that looks, I call it the two-tone brick, reminds me of a lot of the Cabbagetown houses, which is a rare example. Probably there were more of them at one time, and that speaks to again. But because when you think of, you remind me too, the whole neighborhood of Leaside that used to have an airport. And Carolyn Smith tells us there used to be a farm, and
it was a big farm. It was originally attributed to William Lee, and so now where the Leaside Community Gardens is, that's where his homestead was. Anything to the east of Laird, or along Laird, that was airstrip. It was used during the Second World War. There were two munitions factories. There was a hospital there. But then all of the rest of Leaside with its, curving roads, it was purposely designed that way in the Garden City style, which is sort of a urban planning type that came out of England, that you had a portion for work or for industry, and then you had the homes next door to it, so that it was a live-work community. But those curving was supposed to give, the curving street patterns was intended to provide sort of places to amble, and to provide a contrast to a more linear type of development that you would see on the more industrial or working side of the design.
The only other place I've ever seen that is in Kapuskasing.
Yeah, it's not as common. You can see maybe reminiscence of it in other places in Ontario, but actually purposely built as a Garden City design, it's a pretty unique area.
So have you written a book?
No, just a dissertation, which I've yet to publish.
I think, Susan, I'm sure you have a question.
Just to say, it's 309, I think, Davisville. That was, I can't remember if it was Davis, but the Davis of Davisville. That was his house.
Yeah, it was. And he was, I think, Davis, if I remember correctly. And it's funny, as I was digging at one point through city directories, I realized as I was passing by that 50 years ago, my grandmother lived on Belsize. And I found the house, and she worked at the bank, which has unfortunately been demolished along Yonge Street. That was a shame that it was demoed. But all of this, within the hands of assessment rules or city directories, comes to life in a way that you would never I've appreciated.
Indeed. Well, I mean, my grandparents lived for a while on a street that no longer exists. It became part of Dundas East. I grew up a block away from Bloor Avenue Road, and even before I was born, St. George Street was gutted, including the Eaton Mansion, to put up apartment buildings to support the post-war boom. And it's interesting how people define what's worth keeping. It's, they think, oh, if it's Gothic or Victorian, then yes, we'll keep it. But, most of the west side of Avenue Road, long gone.
It is. There's some really arbitrary markers. Ontario, as the province, will say it's heritage if it's older than 40 years. There are exceptions to that rule. There was, and forgive me, I don't remember the address, but at Toronto Preservation Board the other month, a much more recent property was designated, but it was designed by famous architect Moriyami. So there are exceptions, but who's to say 40 years or not? For those who don't like brutalist architecture, watch out, because that's 40 years old now.
Exactly. It seems to be, do we like it or not? But it's, I'm in a heritage building, the Garden Court Apartments, and they did some upgrades, and actually they had to redesign the iron railings for the doors. They had to replace the concrete steps out back, and they found out that the railings that had no longer fit standard. And accessibility, that's another big thing. So can you adapt to building?
And building code and accessibility norms. There are some exceptions for heritage, little ways that you can creatively adapt in order that you meet accessibility, but not necessarily what the Ontario Building Code and the AODA say. But it definitely poses a challenge for the future. Every time we have to do work on my 1927 house, you realize it's not 2021. Yeah. Everything's a little more custom.
Except it's always the best thing about custom built, at least heritage buildings, whether they be commercial or residential, is it gives you an idea of what life was like. I'm guessing your fireplace was one of those coal burning ones, so that it's narrower than most. People didn't realize that. Buildings, office buildings with walk up only. We've got one on Bayview, and people are saying, but the design in it just screams 1950s. This is what people did.
It is. And as reactionary to different zoning, I was listening to a fantastic podcast the other week, and it was actually about Toronto and called The Missing Middle. And there's a book about that as well, where Toronto's own zoning bylaws were fundamental to the way that it was constructed, that at some point they didn't want small buildings, those walk-ups. After 1912, none of those. So we have giant condominiums, but nothing smaller, because, well, the British who lived here wanted to make sure it stayed British. So we purposely privileged a single dwelling, semi or detached family home. And that really influenced neighborhood development in the city. And we're still grappling with that thinking and that zoning going forward as we think, well, how do we make the city more affordable?
What I've noticed downtown along Bloor and Yonge Street is that, it was residential. You can see where the residents were. And it seems to be that some power does not want people to know that this part of the city was residential at one point. It's like, no, we were always like this.
So it was a pocket of a little bit of everything. I think with the exception of Yorkville, which is sort of interesting, which was supposed to be built in Tony, to the point where they moved the cemetery, which is now Mount Pleasant Cemetery, because it's bad business to have a cemetery in the middle of a really splashy neighborhood. So they just moved everybody. And that's why we have the land that we do.
Well, there's very little left of Yorkville. I mean, you lost the south half of Cumberland to the subway, and most of the north part still. But I mean, Yorkville, it started when they built the hotel in the mid 70s, and it's just been downhill from there.
Yeah, and there's a few little reminiscences in some of the smaller built form, and that you sort of see that where the 60s and that musical scene, you know, it's undergone such an interesting historical evolution as being this place of change and rebellion, you know, in the 50s and 60s. And I wouldn't call it a place of change and rebellion now.
No, other words for that. Ayla, Ayla, did you have any thoughts on this? Or John Joseph?
Okay. One more thought, but maybe it's a thought to take you away because you probably spent an hour answering it. Okay, you're given the job, your favorite, your most coveted job with the City of Toronto by the present mayor. What would that job be? And you'd have an unlimited budget. What will you do? But I mean, that's it.
Oh, I'd just be city historian. I don't want the planning job. There are too many headaches and people who want it their way and no other. But I think, you know, if I, you know, there's been bandied about that conversation to turn Old City Hall into the City Museum. I think that would be a marvelous project to be in charge of, and to try and uncover some of the different ways that our history is expressed, whether through a Michael Ondaatje book or through a heritage designation or through a Doors Open walk. I think to be able to pull those threads together would be a really unique force for good in this city. And I think it would, again, it's a conversation to have.
I think you should be on the Doors Open committee. Unfortunately, it's become a committee that's lost its way.
Yes.
Because now that you can put a brand new condominium on the tour, which has no, if the whole point of Doors Open was to teach people about the heritage, well, the ship has left the harbor and the heritage is still ashore. It's not there.
True. Although sometimes, you know, every once in a while you get a lovely condominium and they do the right thing and they restore the inside and they restore the facade and they build it within to their own development. So, you know, sadly, it's more few and far between than I would like.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's been wonderful. We're actually, unfortunately, our funding for this ran out, but we'll have to figure out what we do moving forward. But certainly we'd love to have you back again, because this is actually remarkable. You know what? Well, I mean, not our 100th anniversary for Manor Road is 2025, but maybe we can have you be on the planning committee, which will hopefully start sooner than later, and help us, you know, maybe bring alight some of the why did certain things get built the way they did. I mean, there's another church not far from here, Glebe Road United,
yes.
Which, I mean, the comedy of it was a smaller church at Davisville at one time, and they built, I think it was supposed to be the CE wing, but the fact that the sanctuary is on the second or third floor makes no logical sense whatsoever.
No, it's interesting, those little anachronisms, you know, you come across that and you wonder why the heck was it built there? But at the time they must have had a really good reason.
It made sense, yes, indeed. Yes.
Oh,
So I'll pass back over to Susan to
Okay, thank you. That was fascinating. I'd love to have you back sometime.
Anytime, or we can just, you know, have coffee and chat. Anytime.
YouTube channel. Do you have a YouTube channel? You should have one.
I do not, but I'll add that to my list.
Okay. Anyway, I hope you can join us next week. We have Moms Stop the Harm, which is mothers trying to help children with substance abuse problems. And it's an area that, you know, we don't even like to admit, let alone do anything about. So I hope you can join us then.